Great. For those of you that are on, welcome. My name's Stephen Embleton. I'm going to be reading from my new young adult fantasy Bones and Runes. It was published this year in February in the UK in paperback. So yeah, there's Bones and Runes, and then Soul Searching. Guardbridge are actually at the convention in person in the dealer's room. So yeah, if you want to get hard copies, Bones and both of them you can get on Amazon and from the publishers and Waterstones, etc. So yeah, if you want to check those out. So I just want to give you a bit of background, and then I'll do the reading and kind of give a few minutes towards the end. If there's any questions or comments in the chat, we can look at those. So essentially, Bones and Runes is I started writing it about 2016. It was started as a short story, which is very much the first chapter that ended up in the book. And I wanted to really put my kids were teenagers at the time, and I really wanted to see them on paper, the world that they live in, and it's urban fantasy that's set in KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, centering around the city of Durban. And we do go other places within the narrative, which is quite cool. The main premise is that there's really three protagonists. So in this book, which is book one, the main protagonist is Umlilo, who is Izangoma. So we go into Zulu traditions, Zulu mythology. We go into the spirit realm, which is Abapanzi in Zulu cosmology. And so through the dynamics of the three friends, we get to kind of see their respective magic and how they wield it. And as 20-somethings, they're discovering their own world and their own magic. So Mlilo with Izangomas, they traditionally have their bones, their amatambo, which is their means of interpreting the messages from the other side, from the ancestors. And so that bag of bones, if you want to call it that, of Mlilo's are taken away from him by force. And that's how we start the story, is that has been taken away from him. And he calls on his friend Dan, who is a druid. He's a bard and druid in training. And so I bring in Dan's Celtic background, the Celtic mythology, and then through the drama that the two guys bring into the story, their friend Amira, who is a Hindu mage, she gets roped into the adventure, even though she's got her own side quests that she's trying to do. So yeah, where I'm going to read from, I'm going to read on the screen, but where we're going to read from is in chapter 10 of the story. The two guys are in Abapanzi, which is a spirit world, and they are on the trail of Ngungumbane, who is a porcupine kind of entity that is one of the main villains' lackeys, basically, and has done the dirty work of taking the bones from Mlilo. So the two guys are hot on their trail. Okay, so I'll get into the reading now. The two men weaved their way through the growing number of rocks and boulders scattered along the dry river sand, the sides of the ravine obscured by any sign of a horizon. The sheer orange cliff faces of iron oxide stained sandstone, a stark contrast to the deep greens and blacks of the lush forest hiding their bases within the damp leaves below. The occasional ivory-colored trunk of a tree stretched upward, topped by a canopy casting a wide shadow of the bushes beneath. Thick vines draped elegantly from their branches. Dan reached out and touched the hairy frond of a fern, part of a large flat-top patch creating an open area of bright green among the pale rocks. Mlilo, a few paces ahead, seemed cut off at the midriff, his upper body gliding through the mass, hands held flat above the leaves as he stroked them. Rounding a towering oval boulder in the path, Dan worked his jaw, wiggling his finger in his ear. The cicada whistles are hectic here. He placed a hand on the cool mass to steady his footing and found Mlilo standing, looking at the clearing ahead of them. There are no cicadas here, Mgunam. Like a giant had stamped a foot in the forest. A flat rock, at least 5 meters by 10 meters, extended at a low angle from the edge of the forest to a third of the way into the clearing and disappeared under the pale sand. The occasional rock and stone dotted the remaining surface, a beach waiting for the tide to roll in. The dry riverbed's sand was undisturbed. And the whistling? I keep telling you, your Amadlozi are probably screaming in your ear holes for you to listen to them. He flapped a hand at Dan. Shh now. The distant sound of 2 male vervet monkeys calling, bounced around the valley. That's a warning. Mlilo crouched down, focusing on the ground ahead. Dan followed Mlilo's gaze as he tracked along the exposed sand, tracing a neat pattern he saw for the first time, leading through the center of the clearing and ending abruptly at a dark, black bush about a meter high and wide. A ghostly smoke or dust hung in the air around it. He heard Mlilo's sudden intake of breath. As if an echo, a grunt emanated from what Dan could only guess was behind the bush. A fresh puff of rising dust around its base reaffirmed this. It's her, whispered Mlilo. Behind the bush? Shh, said Mlilo, standing and taking 2 slow paces forward. She's digging. The bush shivered. Dry, spike-like branches rustled and crackled against one another, then stopped. Dan realized the bush was the porcupine. Crab walking to the left in a wide arc, Mlilo indicated to Dan to mirror his position to the right. Dan mouthed the word small and held a thumb and forefinger slightly apart. Mlilo slowly shook his head from side to side. Kulu, big, he mummed, back at Dan. A good space apart, Mlilo stepped closer, Dan doing the same, both locking their eyes on the motionless mass ahead of them. Dan felt his muscles tense at Mlilo's unexpected shout. Ngungumbane! Within closer proximity to the mass, Dan made out pale bands along the spines. At the core, the black and white needles nervously reached upwards, began to collapse and streamline against the form beneath. The layers of quills, a dusty black coat beneath, covered the pair of thick legs, hind legs, revealed as the body raised and edged backwards. More and more emerged from what appeared to be the shallow pit in the earth. Dust and sand spilled off the bristling black and white form. Dan frantically fumbled into his rune pouch and withdrew the odd-shaped N or H of Hagalaz engraved on the wooden piece. Disruption and events beyond your control. Oh, great, said Dan to himself and gripped the piece of wood in his left hand. He took a step back and breathed in. Mlilo held his ground. I see I'm now the one coming up behind you, Ngumkumbane, and yet I still announce myself rather than attacking like a coward. One of the hind legs stamped a black-clawed foot hard in the dirt. The vibrations heard and felt in the soles of Dan's feet. Should I start by holding your arms behind you and pushing a sharp object at your throat? Where is a rock I can smash across your head as I retreat into the shadows like the sniveling familiar that you are? Errant girl to whom? A deep grunt blew up dust, and the porcupine, pivoting on her haunches to face the 2 men, raised herself to a solid white stance. Dan took in the immovable-looking adversary. Acknowledging to himself that she wasn't standing fully erect, she was at least 7 feet of brown-black fur-covered muscle, unable to make out her face clearly, but the pinpricks of white gave away the 2 shiny black eyes trained on them. The coat at her shoulders smoothly turned into black and white spines, thickening as they extended down her back, stopping at the buttocks and hanging down to the ground like a splayed tail. A shimmer of quills hung from her shoulders, ending abruptly where he assumed her deltoid muscles would be under the fur, extending down her arms and blending into the inky, leathery skin of her hands. He noticed the dull shine of her black claws protruding from 4 of her tensed fingers of her right hand, the thumbs a clawless, chunky stub meant for gripping and holding. Her left hand balled into a mallet-like fist. Another stamp, and like a dog shaking off water, in the blink of an eye, she violently shook her head. The sound of 1,000 rattlesnakes from the back of her head ran down her shoulders, back and into the thicker quills hanging at her waist and skimming the dirt. The last of the dust and grime fell away from her front, leaving an eerie atmosphere around her. All I want are my Amatamba army. If you'll just step away from the hole, I can retrieve them and go home. Ngumbane hunched down further, grabbing a handful of sand and threw it into the gaping hole behind her. God damn it, said Mlilo through clenched teeth. What's that about? A low rumble pulsed through the earth, stopping Dan mid-sentence. Your friend's bones, the porcupine's low, raspy voice reverberated as she returned to her original stance, have been sent to those that ordered them. She blew the dust from her hand in Mlilo's direction. Dan could have sworn he saw her smile at his friend, a smile or a snarl. She shuffled 2 paces backwards, scraping rather than stepping her large, wide feet through the dirt, always on a firm footing. Almost crossing his arms, Dan reached into his left cowl sleeve, gripping the cool wood of his wand, Fagus, and in a smooth movement pulled it from the leather sheath, arms open and ready for what came next. Turning at her waist, neck and head immovable on her wide shoulders, Ngumbane aimed at Dan, her fists tightly clenched, then pivoted towards Mlilo and snorted. Belying her bulky frame, the sparky black figure sidestepped to her right, paws scraping through the fine sand. Her focus was firmly on Mlilo. As if performing a dance, Ngumbane twirled and rattled, rose up and then crouched, clearly drawing a circle around the 2 men poised for an attack she may deliver. And her attack came. She leapt at Mlilo, left arm driving forward as his chest She leapt at Mlilo, left arm driving forward at his chest, but a burst of dull orange from his hands hit the solid fist, stopping Ngumbane like a wall. No surprise, no hesitation. She stepped back into her crazed path, arcing around towards Dan. Dust permeated the battleground, the surroundings almost obscured, but Dan tracked the dark figure as she approached. Her stomach, Dan. I got this, he responded, adrenaline hitting his vocal cords. He knew what was coming. He could feel the energy pushing up from the earth below his feet, through his knees, building in his stomach and chest. Expecting an upper attack like Mlilo, Dan misread the feign. Ngumbane ducked and struck out her one leg, swiping Dan off his feet. His zap of energy barely singed the fur on her head as he slammed into the ground. A dull pain ran through his shoulder and head, followed by panic, realizing he no longer held his wand. Before she could reverse her quill-laden back against him, a blaze of red light filled his vision. Mlilo's fire crackled over the porcupine, who rolled through the sand and back onto her haunches. Dan choked on the dust and dirt filling his lungs, trying to find the white wood he knew was somewhere. With a snort and a stamp, Ngumbane stood at her original position, eyes darting between the 2 men. Closing his eyes, Dan forced himself to calm down, took a deep breath, and got to his knees. The sand around him was in disarray. No Fagus. He looked from Mlilo to the ground to the porcupine. He had to stay alert, but he had to find his wand. Where the hell is Amira when you need her? He said. She'd kick the shit out of this pincushion monster. Ignoring Dan, Ngumbane fixed her beady eyes on Mlilo, turned over her right fist and opened it. The whiteness of the bone seemed to glow in the black of her thick-skinned palm. Mlilo's sudden intake of breath caused Dan to watch his friend's eyes widen. He noticed Mlilo mentally restrain himself from automatically stepping forward to retrieve the bone, just as Ngumbane brought it up to her mouth. As bright white as the object in her palm, her freakishly large upper and lower incisors glinted through the blackness of her face. No, shouted Mlilo. What the hell is happening, Mlilo? Dan rested an arm on his knee, getting the strength to stand. She eased her fist and the bone into the side of her jaw, and what sounded like cracking rock broke the quiet. She's, hesitated Mlilo. She's grinding my great-grandmother's jawbone. A wave of heat from Mlilo pummeled Dan, almost knocking him off his feet. Bree! Holding her position and gaze at Mlilo, after a few more crunches, the porcupine tossed the now reduced bone into the sand a few paces in front of her, a mere 3 meters from Mlilo and Dan. Her tongue protruded from him for a moment, sliding over her rodent teeth, savoring the meal. Dan spotted his wand a few feet away and barely exposed in the sand. I assume she can literally grind our bones to dust, he said, feeling his confidence well up inside. Her belly is her weakness, Mfuetu. Do what you like, but that's where we have to hit, and hit hard. If we can get there, and if you don't take me out in the process, Bre. Mlilo shot Dan a look. Eyes on Ngumbane, knowing where Fagus lay, Dan took one ape-like stride along the ground and stopped. The porcupine's small eyes darted to Dan, then back at Mlilo. A deep growl began to rumble from within her chest as she tensed her shoulders and back muscles, lowering her head further. The attached quills rose up in a crowning display of shining black and white sparks fanning out like the collar of a cloak. The two men took in the spectacle of this regal-looking monster, her cloak of quills making her appear even larger than before. The lower hanging spines quivered, giving off the distinct rattling sound heard earlier. But this time it was ceaseless, like the switch on a motor had been flipped, overpowering all other sounds and penetrating their skulls. Mlilo, shiso Mlilo, murmured Mlilo, almost inaudible to Dan under the din of the crackling quills. His left hand was turning back and forth over his cupped palm to the reverse, like turning a ball in a hand. Bashisa Panzi, Bashisa Otulini. A dull vortex of orange light grew around both hands. The occasional spark spat outwards. I'm going to leave it there. It's quite an exciting piece of action that I had quite a bit of fun writing. So I hope anybody that is interested gets to read the action. The guys have bitten off more than they can chew, to say the least. So thanks everybody that's been here. The one thing I just want to mention, particularly in terms of the language, there's obviously isiZulu that's featured in it, but also one of the godlike beings is based off Haiseb, who is a Tam and Namakwen folklore character, and there's plenty others that are featured in the story. Naturally going into the spirit world. The spirit world is the spirit world, and so Mlilo takes us all on that journey from his perspective as a Izangoma. We really get an insight into some of the Southern African cosmologies and folk tales, and key characters that have been passed down through the generations. So the one element that I was really excited to include was the Isibeke Sohlamvu writing system, which got there, which has been developed. It's used in for the Southern African Ntu languages. So the symbology, the creation of it is all worked around those the linguistic forms of the Ntu languages. So I just hope you all enjoyed that. Some African magic young adult fantasy. So I hope you guys check it out. And I'm working on book 2 and book 3. I kind of know where they're going, so it's all exciting. Great. If anybody's got any questions, you're welcome to. We've got a minute or two, but thanks very much for listening. Thanks, Amy. Very interesting. Cool. Also, as some of you may have seen, the books are on Amazon, and Guardbridge with the soul searching science fiction novel. They are at the dealer's room. Great. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the con.